Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for our Dean's Lecture in partnership with the Yale Institute for Global Health, the Poynter Fellowship, and the Yale Journalism Initiative. Please note that this event is being recorded. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Megan Ranney, Dean of the Yale School of Public Health, to open our event.
Thank you, Holly. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you back for our first Dean's Lecture of the year. First of a few exciting things this year, so definitely keep your eyes open. Welcome back to Winslow, and I know there are a lot of you on Zoom, so hello, Zoom. Welcome to you all as well. Grateful, as always, for the ability to be hybrid. A big thank you to the Institute for Global Health, particularly to Mike Skonieczny for making this happen, the Poynter Fellowship, and the Yale Journalism Initiative. And as in keeping with our policy, letting you all know that this event is being recorded. So as you all know, one of the strategic pillars that I articulated as I came into this deanship was around communication as well as around inclusion. And I think today's lecture epitomized both of those. Stephanie, both in her long history of incredible journalism, but also in her tireless work to shine a light on the health problems that folks are not otherwise talking about, has really, I think, demonstrated to many of us the power of communication, but also the power of communication on behalf of those who otherwise are not necessarily being paid attention to, and on behalf of health states and the way in which health intersects with the rest of society that is sometimes not being paid attention to. I think Stephanie is one of the national and international leaders in health journalism, in her way that she sees that intersection between health and society. And so I'm really excited to have her join us today. To formally introduce her, Stephanie is the global health reporter for the New York Times. She's a veteran foreign correspondent, has reported from more than 80 countries. And for the New York Times, she covers pandemics, neglected diseases, and the social, economic, and political forces that determine health care and health access around the world. Before joining the Times, Stephanie spent 21 years reporting for the Globe and Mail and served as bureau chief in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. She also covered development issues and conflicts, including on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before joining the Globe in 1998, she was based in the Middle East and wrote for publications including Newsweek and The Independent of London. She's also published books. And one of the things that I think is most amazing about Stephanie and looking at our students in the audience is that she will say out loud that she is not trained as an epidemiologist. She is not trained as an infectious disease physician, right? And yet she manages to tell the truth about these stories in ways that I think that her training has uniquely prepared her to do. And so I hope that over the course of the next hour, as she shares her story with us, that it will serve to an inspiration to all of us on how we can use our own experience to help create change in the world. And so with that, Stephanie, welcome. Wait a second. I was supposed to do, I always forget. As part of the welcome, we're Yale and we do little swag bags. So thank you for coming and joining us. A little thing to take home with you.
That's lovely. Thank you. All right. And microphone wise, you can all hear me. We're fine. All right. Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Ranney. And thank you, all of you. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Zoom people. And I really want to say, first of all, a big thank you. I'm grateful for the invitation, but I want to say thank you in particular to Mike Skonieczny, who's been so patient. I spend my life essentially living at the mercy of sort of somewhat despotic consular officers whose whole existence seems to be to keep me from getting visas. And so when I finally get one, I need to just go, which obviously makes me a very difficult person to make a plan with. And so I'm sure there were many moments along the way here in which Mike deeply regretted this invitation. And he's probably as astonished as I am that I'm actually here. But it's a great pleasure to get to talk to you about this. And I wanted essentially today to talk to you about my title, as you just heard, Global Health Reporter, has these two big expansive words in it, but actually I really only tell one story. I really only tell the story about some kind of innovation a vaccine, a drug, a health technology, and the people on whom it's having a great impact, and all of the other people who can't get it. That really is the sort of story that I have been writing about for 25 years. And I'm particularly interested to talk a little bit today about how I'm starting to see that happen in a new way that I feel like we're really not paying attention to, and we are about to be really kind of broadsided by. I don't feel like we're really reckoning with what's happening yet. So that's what I would like to talk to you about. But I thought, since this is meant to be also a journalism-related conversation, I would just tell you a little bit about how I wound up doing this. I did do lots of, as you heard, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. There was a moment during the war, early in the war in Iraq, when I was in Baghdad, and the American military had taken the city just like maybe a couple of days before, and I was on a rooftop, I think, trying to get reception for a satellite phone. And it was really late at night, but it was so bright on that rooftop because of the quantity of reporters who were there doing stand-ups with their sort of little spotlights back to their home country. And it was in every language you could imagine. And I just thought, I don't need to be here. People have got this covered. And I just thought about the trips that I had been taking when I wasn't in these conflict zones. I'd been going to sub-Saharan Africa whenever I could kind of carve out the time, sometimes on my holidays, to go to cover stories such as the wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia, the war in northern Uganda, the war in Somalia, what was then an incipient famine in Ethiopia. And while I was doing those things, what had become more and more feel to me like a pressing story was what was happening with HIV and the hollowing out of societies that you could see happening with HIV. And I wouldn't, when I was on those stories, run into any other Western reporters. And quite often I also would not run into a lot of African reporters, not because they weren't on that story, but I think there was a little bit of the frog in the pot of boiling water problem, right? That when you are so surrounded by the epidemic and then it's part of every aspect of your life, then it stops really feeling like a news story. And so I just thought I could be in Baghdad with all of these people, or I could be covering this other thing that I think is really important, where there really doesn't seem to be a lot of media attention. And so I said to the Globe and Mail that I was going to quit and move to Johannesburg or Dar es Salaam and start covering this. And they said, fine, okay, you can go for 6 months. And then the coverage was really popular with readers in ways that I think my editors, and I know that my editors didn't expect. And I think that's because readers are not stupid and they knew something really important was happening and they wanted to know what it was. So I wound up staying for 6 years, and I wrote, I was a bureau chief. And so when you're the bureau chief, you get up one day and you write a politics story, and you get up the next day and you write an economic story, and then you write a military story. But I moved to Johannesburg at a time when, so I was in my early 30s, 35% of the population, 34% of the population my age was living with HIV, which in the early 2000s was untreated HIV, right? There was no HIV treatment in Johannesburg. So in that situation, HIV stories are political stories, and they are economic stories because your economy is being profoundly affected by this. And they are military stories because 30% of your armed forces are living with HIV. Every story was an HIV story. And it became, it was sort of the beginning of when I started to think about how health stories, my grandmother used to say to me, maybe your grandmother said something like this to you, you don't have anything if you don't have your health. Well, I mean, that's true. But when you think, when I think about this job and people say to me like, oh, covering diseases, covering germs. Well, no, like I'm covering health because health is about, it's about fairness and justice, and it's about caregiving, which is our most intimate relationships, and the who we care about and who matters to us. It's about ability and disability. It's about opportunity and often the economic upheaval of families. Like those are health stories, right? But they're also the stories about all the things that matter the most to people. And so that's kind of how I found my way into health journalism, kind of unexpectedly. And unexpectedly, but I guess, you know, in a sense, it was just kind of the recognition that these are the stories about the things that are the most important to people. So I did that in sub-Saharan Africa for 6 years, and then I moved to South Asia because the expectation at the time was that the same sort of overwhelming HIV epidemic that had unfolded in sub-Saharan Africa was going to happen in South Asia, which it didn't. It took the UN agencies a little while to catch up to what a lot of very smart Indian researchers had already been saying for a while. And we can talk more about why that didn't happen later on if people are interested. But I spent 5 years in India and moved to Brazil. And, you know, Brazil didn't have like the same level of kind of critical health stories that you might have seen in a place like Zambia, but there was amazing social policy happening, especially in the first Lula governments, using conditionality and trying to figure out how you could build up a public health system in a place of overwhelming economic inequality. And so I covered those stories there, all of which is to say that I have been doing this for a long time in a lot of places. And even when I have wandered off into other areas of coverage, I sometimes find my way back here. So just to sort of talk a bit about what I've been thinking about in terms of these equity and access issues, I wanted to start today by telling you the story. Maybe you have seen in the last few months these very joyful pictures that have been coming out of sub-Saharan Africa of parents lining up, bringing their kids to get malaria vaccines, right? Malaria vaccines are being rolled out for the first time as part of routine immunization programs, which is amazing, right? This is just, malaria remains one of our biggest killers of children. It was about 610,000 children last year who died. Putting aside the impact on child mortality, and malaria has a massive economic impact, right? Probably somewhere around the neighborhood of $4.5 billion when you combine people's healthcare spending and also lost productivity, lost days of productivity, something I think we not never, but we too rarely think about when we talk about lost productivity is the impact on women and the amount of caregiving. If you live somewhere where your child gets malaria 7 or 8 or 9 times a year and you have 4 or 5 children, right? Then effectively what you do is care for people who have malaria. That's kind of your full-time job. So for all of those reasons, a vaccine for malaria is incredibly valuable and something that people have been working on for a very long time. The story, though, behind how we finally got a vaccine, I think really helps to illustrate some of the big problems that we don't have figured out. It took 35 years and more than $1 billion to get the vaccines we have now. And when I watched people starting to get the vaccine, I just kept thinking, like, how exactly did this take this long? And I know that part of the reason is that the science is complicated, right? This is the first vaccine for a parasite. It was really, really hard to do. But it turns out there's also other reasons why this took so long. The research on the vaccine started in the 1980s with the US military, and they partnered with the pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline, now known as GSK. And by the late 1990s, they had some good prototype vaccines. And this is where a problem, which you will hear me mention more than once today, comes into this story, because where do you get the money to do field clinical trials? These were going to have to be trials in Africa, in communities, in pretty low resource communities. Where do you get the money to do a big clinical trial in Africa if the product you're making is something for which the only market is going to be people who can't afford to buy it, right? This is a problem which bedevils the drug development industry. So GSK looked around for a partner, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put up $100 million to fund these first clinical trials. They partnered with the global health NGO PATH to make these, they funneled the money through PATH to make these trials happen. And by 2014, finally, remember we've just gone from like late 1980s to mid 1990s to 2014, because that's how long it takes to take a vaccine through a large randomized controlled trial. You finally have clinical trial results that show that this vaccine is pretty effective. And the folks at GSK are pretty excited, PATH is pretty excited, and they start making plans for how they're going to produce this thing. And then a crazy thing happens. And the thing that happens is the Gates Foundation pulls their support. They don't actually pull their money out of it, but there's there's a sort of big shakeup inside the foundation. The foundation is big enough and powerful enough that when something like this happens, it has huge reverberations and consequences. There's a shakeup inside the foundation in the malaria division, and the people who used to be really excited about, or people who still are excited about the vaccine, kind of lose power to the camp that's really excited about eradication. And they go from being very excited about the vaccine to very not excited about the vaccine. And when you are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and you are as big and influential as you are, that casts a chill over the whole field. And so other funders who might have been looking to get into supporting the development and rollout of this malaria vaccine also decide, literally, a very senior person at the WHO put it to me, if the Gates Foundation, they know something we don't know. What do they know about this vaccine that means they're taking their money out? We weren't going to put our money in there because Gates took their money out. Well, the Gates Foundation folks who were part of that decision at the time now say to me they didn't anticipate the consequence. I would call that a somewhat feeble excuse. If you are as big and influential as you are, you might have anticipated that consequence. I find the foundation both relishes the amount of power it has and also is very uncomfortable thinking or talking about the amount of power that it has. So now we have this vaccine that's done quite well in clinical trials. I should say, actually, the clinical trials found somewhere around a 33% protection for infectious disease. Is that super high, especially not now that we're all in the era of COVID, where we expect 95% protection out of a vaccine? Does 30 sound very good? It does not. However, if you are that mom in Burkina Faso whose kid gets malaria 10 times a year, 30 sounds pretty good, right? Especially because nobody's come along and offered you any real solutions to malaria basically ever. You'll take a vaccine that's only partially protective, right? There's a real desire particularly from African health ministers, to move forward with this thing. There are people within the Gates Foundation who say that's not high enough efficacy. This is not worth it to put more money into this to keep going. We would need a vaccine we need a vaccine that works better for this to be the best use of resources. And there's other more logical places that will have more impact. The data shows will have more impact. And that's where we should put our money. So that's what they decide to do. They take their money out of it. And this leaves GSK with a problem, because now they're about to go into production with this vaccine, which again, they're making it for people who can't afford to buy it, right? So now what are they supposed to do? They submitted to the European Medicine Agency for approval, and they get that approval. So that's what's called stringent regulatory authority approval. A drug regulator in a high resource setting has said that this vaccine is safe. And then they submit it for something called World Health Organization pre-qualification, or PQ as we call it in the business. And that, for those of you who've been lucky enough to live your life unfamiliar with this process, PQ is the process through which the department and the WHO evaluates drugs, vaccines, new technologies, and says this is safe. They inspect the facilities where they're made, and they vouch for those facilities being a high quality facility. And they also say this is a good use of resources. So if you are an under-resourced country with a finite amount of money to spend on tuberculosis, this is the most effective drug. This is the best treatment. This is a good vaccine. This is what you should do. It is a global designation, theoretically relevant to all countries. It's not super relevant to the US, where you have the FDA. I'm a Canadian. We rely on Health Canada. Europe has the EMA. They don't really care so much about WHO pre-qualification. Low resource countries that don't have something like the FDA to do that job for them really rely on this process. The other people who need this process are Gavi, the organization that procures vaccines for low and middle income countries, and UNICEF, who obviously buy vaccines and drugs. They are not allowed by, like it is within the terms of the organizations, that they can only spend their resources on organizations that have this WHO PQ stamp. So that is a requirement for Gavi to buy a vaccine. So this malaria vaccine needs this authorization, right? Clearly. So GSK and PAP submit the vaccine, well, formally GSK, they submit the vaccine for WHO pre-qualification, and there's a big meeting in Geneva, and all the WHO malaria people are there. There's quite a few of them, and the vaccine people are there. And I am told there was a large, very hostile conversation. And at the end of it, they're completely split. And the malaria people are saying, yes, let's go tomorrow, right? Look at the burden of malaria globally. Look at the impact on child deaths. This will help. And the vaccine people say, yeah, nope, we're not ready to authorize this one. And the eventual conclusion out of this whole thing is a compromise. WHO says that it's going to do what's called, they call it a pilot implementation. There's two things that they're worried about. One is the safety of the vaccine. There's some suggestion in the safety studies or in the clinical trials that have happened up until then that the vaccine might have been causing or at least correlated with these unexplained cases of meningitis. So that's problem one. The second one is the way that this vaccine works. You have to have 4 shots. The fourth shot has to be a year after the third shot. If you don't show up to get the 4th shot, the efficacy of the vaccine is very, very low. So that's hard, right? To keep in touch with the family over the course of 2 years and make sure they're bringing that kid back. That's a challenge. Also, unfortunately, this malaria vaccine, it's delivered on a kind of wacky schedule that doesn't really line up with any of the existing child immunizations. So now you're trying to get people to bring their kids in for a shot when it's not when they regularly would have come. It's messy. There's real concerns about whether really low resource health systems, which is the place, it's places like Burkina Faso that need this the most, are they going to be able to do it? So the WHO says we're going to do another trial. And at that point, GSK says, we're out, right? We have been pouring money into this vaccine, which we don't even know how it's going to make us any money all of this time. And now, just at the moment, it was like a Lucy in the football moment for those of you who are old enough to remember Charlie Brown, right? It was like, okay, you're finally going to make your vaccine. Actually, no, we're going to do another mammoth trial. And GSK says, forget it. And so the WHO says, well, we're going to do this. We're going to do this pilot. They've never really done anything like this before. They're going to do it in 3 countries. It's going to have hundreds of thousands of children. It's going to cost close to $100 million. The WHO doesn't exactly have $100 million lying around under the couch cushions, right? It takes them a couple more years to come up with the money. So now how many years in are we? Many, many decades into trying to make this vaccine. And this, GSK says, forget it. We are reassigning our production lines. We are not going to wait around for this any longer. This might be the right moment for me to tell you about the tree. It's a tree in this story. A vaccine, my apologies to any of the microbiologists in the room, but for those who are not from the world of microbiology, my 2-line explanation of what goes into a vaccine: you have an antigen, which is the thing that causes your body to generate an immune response. Sometimes it's a fragment of a virus, something like that. And then often you have an adjuvant, it's like the Gatorade in the process. It's the thing that really amps up this immune response. So this vaccine it has the very classy name of RTSS-AS01. And the AS01, I know, say that 10 times fast. The AS01, the A stands for adjuvant, and it's this proprietary product of GSK's. It's a very powerful and effective adjuvant. They use it in a number of products. It comes from the bark of a tree called the Quillaja saponaria. It's a Chilean tree that was used by indigenous people for a long time. GSK has used this tree bark to make this adjuvant. It's a very powerful and effective adjuvant. They use it not only in this malaria vaccine, for which, by the way, the estimates were that they might be able to sell it for $10 a shot. They also use it in things like Shingrix, which, I've had it. Maybe lots of you have had it. The vaccine for shingles costs about $350 a shot. So you can see, if you were presented with multiple choices, if you're a publicly traded company, you had multiple things that you might do with your vaccine, with your adjuvant, you can see that there might be some pressure to put it into something that was going to make you slightly more money. So, the tree. Nobody likes to talk about the tree. So at this moment, you have the WHO with their pilot study, and you have GSK saying, we're going to find something else to do with our production facilities and also, by the way, our adjuvants. And we might never have got to the point of having a malaria vaccine, except at this moment, an organization called MedAccess steps in. And it's an organization that uses, at this point, mostly funding from government to do what's called de-risking, which is like a finance industry term, but to try to do something about the lack of incentive that a company like GSK has to put their money into doing something that ultimately is not particularly going to generate a profit. And so MedAccess comes in at this point and says to Gavi, says to GSK essentially, allows Gavi to say to GSK, look, just keep making it. Go ahead and make it, whether it's approved or not. Just make this vaccine. And if at the end of the day, these pilot studies are effective and we get WHO pre-qualification, then you can write us a credit note for the money that we've put up. You can pay us back in vaccine, right? And if the vaccine fails, the pilot study fails, we don't get pre-qualification, then we'll eat that loss. And it's really important, but one of the reasons this matters is that it takes a really long time. Like, you don't get WHO pre-qualification and then call downstairs and say, hey guys, we're good to go, fire up that line, let's see if we can make 100,000 by Friday, right? It's like a multi-year process to put in a production line, start making something, make test batches, get your manufacturing process, the quality control approved for your vaccination process. It's long. And so you need them to keep that line working, right? So MedAccess brokers this deal and GSK agrees to keep producing vaccine. And we flash forward a couple of years and the clinical trial results come in and they're good. There was no safety signal, there was no truth to the safety signal. There's no more cases of meningitis. And families, clinics, governments manage okay with this wacky vaccination schedule. And so the vaccine gets pre-qualification for the WHO and we're good to go. This is a very exciting moment. People who were in the Gavi board meetings have described to me these meetings where African health ministers are saying, like, when are we enough about the COVID vaccine? Like, enough, you people going on and on about COVID. When are we getting this malaria vaccine, right? Like, it's the thing that's the priority for people. And this is the moment at which GSK says, oh yeah, no, the malaria vaccine, right. Yeah, well, we could get you 12 million of those by the end of next year. That might sound okay. Remember that it's a 4-dose vaccine, so that's 3 million children at maximum if everything went well. And you're talking about more or less 850 million children who live in malaria susceptible zones. The news that you were going to be able to do 3 million children over the course of a couple of years, this does not land well. And that might have been where we were stuck, except in a very surprising turn of events, there was a second vaccine. There's a group of researchers at the University of Oxford who have used a very similar technology, and they've made a vaccine candidate called R21. I don't know who names these things. They've made R21 and does not make my life easier, let me tell you, as a person trying to get readers to engage with this. RTSS-AS01, that's really, the second vaccine uses a very similar technology, and they've taken it through phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, and it's even better than the first one. It generates even more of an immune response. But of course, a small group of researchers at Oxford do not have the money to put on a massive clinical trial in sub-Saharan Africa. Stop me if you've heard this before. And that might have been the end of that vaccine, except that the Serum Institute of India, which is the world's largest vaccine maker, it's a private company in India, they are smart folks, and they decide to roll the dice on this one. They've seen the data from the first vaccine. It looks pretty good. And they decide they're gonna try this. And they put up the money for the phase 3 clinical trial, and then at risk, they start production, because remember, it takes a long time to do this. They start production of this second vaccine even before they know whether the clinical trial results are going to be good or whether it's going to get WHO pre-qualification. The clinical trial results are really good, and this vaccine moves much more quickly through pre-qualification because, it wasn't the first, it wasn't totally new, it was very closely related to this first vaccine. Also, arguably because the WHO had the grace to be a bit embarrassed about the debacle from the last one and how long it took. So this one gets approved pretty quickly. And it's only because the Serum Institute has been advance making it and stocking it up in their warehouses in Pune that, in fact, you're seeing this vaccine starting to be rolled out in a number of countries this year. This is what actually got us to this point. But I just think it's kind of amazing to look back on that. Like, it's wonderful, again, to see children actually getting the vaccine. But also when you look back and think about how many times along the way we almost didn't get the vaccine and the whole thing almost fell apart over the question of who was going to pay for it, I find that very troubling. And this question of what the mechanism is that should pay for these things really has been this story that I like, the story that I keep telling over and over and over again. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago about cholera. Cholera deaths are up all over the world. That's a headline that should have been written in 1450, right? Like it is not difficult to keep people from getting cholera. They need clean water. Once they get cholera, you can save a person's life from cholera for 50 cents. It costs 50 cents in oral rehydration salts and a very minimally trained community health worker. Antibiotics, if you can get them, great, also helpful, but like not essential. It is not difficult to save people from cholera, but cholera deaths are actually rising. One of the reasons that deaths are rising is that once you have a cholera outbreak, health systems very quickly, again, health systems in fragile settings where you're likely to have a cholera outbreak, get overwhelmed very quickly. One of the things you can do to keep that from happening is vaccinating people. There is no cholera vaccine. There hasn't been any cholera vaccine, not none. The global stockpile of cholera vaccine has been empty for 3 years. As soon as those doses come off the production line in South Korea, they are already committed to countries that have asked for them. More than half of the requests that went to Gavi and the WHO last year for emergency cholera vaccine were denied. There's only one country left making cholera vaccine, and God love them. It's a company called U Biologics in South Korea. They're doing everything they can do to try to simplify their production processes, simplify their formula to make more and more of it, because they've looked around and found themselves the only people who make cholera vaccine. All of the other producers have gotten out of the market. They've gotten out of the market because there's no money in cholera vaccines, because who gets cholera? Poor people. Cholera vaccines sell for about $1.50 a vaccine. There's just no money in it. Even there used to be a number of Indian producers and who generally are willing to, at large scale, make generic versions of vaccines and drugs for much smaller margins. Even most of the Indian producers, well, at this point, all of the Indian producers got out of the market, although one is allegedly coming back. So this question of what you do about things that are for diseases that primarily affect poor people is just this sort of this thing that I feel like I write about all the time, and I just don't. There is a degree to which we kind of reinvent the wheel. And I think HIV is maybe the best example of that. I was telling you about how when I moved to Johannesburg, there was about a 35% HIV prevalence rate. At that point in the early 2000s, antiretroviral treatment had been around for a while. My friends back home had been on ART. Friends I had living with HIV had been on ART for a while. I remember very early, maybe 1999, 2000. I remember going to Zambia, being in Lusaka in a church basement, a sort of fluorescent strip lighting in Lusaka, with one of the early groups of people living publicly with HIV, and they had a shoebox. And it was a shoebox that had been mailed from some ACT UP chapter or something in San Francisco, and it had people's discarded meds in it, and they were mailing them to Africa, and people were getting the bottles out and comparing them and trying to figure out which drug was which, and then doling the pills out to people. And that's what people's access to ART looked like at that point. I remember watching families where both parents and a child were infected, and they would get their one family allotment of tablets, and they'd be trying to cut the tablets into thirds so that they could give one to each parent and to the child. And like, again, HIV by this point has already become a chronic illness in North America. And those drugs at that time were being sold for about the access price from drug companies for low-income countries was $12,000 per patient per year, which is obviously entirely out of the reach of the kinds of people who actually needed the drugs, right? And the thing that happened was, there were these amazing treatment action movements that emerged and became these really powerful social forces in these countries. They forced drug companies eventually, out of pure shame, really, forced them to lower the prices of treatment down to about $200, $250. And the way that they did that was something called a voluntary license. And a voluntary license was essentially, it was like this great new idea. So a company like Gilead could voluntarily license their drugs to, at this point, it was Indian generic makers. It was primarily Ranbaxy and Cipla. And they could say, we will continue to sell them for $40,000 per patient per year in the global north. And we will give you the technology, we'll give you the recipe essentially for how to make this drug, and you sell it in the global south. And that model helped bring the price down to about $200 a year. In a lot of places these days, it's about $50 a year. That model worked pretty well. And it also led to the creation of something called the Medicines Patent Pool, which was an effort to try to do this, to have one broker that would take licenses from drug companies and then sort of sub-license them to producers in the global south. And yet, a couple weeks ago, I did a really unusual thing, a thing I almost never do, which is that I wrote a really happy story. It was like a very unfamiliar day at work for me. But I got sent these amazing clinical trial results for a drug called lenacapavir. Lenacapavir is an HIV treatment. It's used as a treatment in North America now. But this was a trial to test it as what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is, can you give people a drug that they'll have in their system that means if they end up being exposed to HIV through sex, through drug use, that they won't get infected? And PrEP, as it's called, has been around a long time, right? You may yourself or know somebody who's on Truvada here in the US. PrEP works great for a lot of people. We haven't figured it out for everybody. And the way that we know that is that young African women remain, at this point, the most vulnerable group. 4,000 young African women, girls, like late teenage girls and women in their early 20s, 4,000 of them a week get infected with HIV. We have not found a way of doing PrEP that really works for them. So the idea with lenacapavir was, could you give people an injection twice a year, just twice a year, right? So you just got to get girls to show up at a clinic, or maybe you could do it at home. Maybe you could do it at door to door. Maybe you could do it at schools the way they're doing the HPV vaccine. Give them this drug twice a year in an injection, and would that protect them from HIV? And the story that I was writing, I called up an amazing South African HIV researcher named Linda Gale Becker. She works in Cape Town. And I have interviewed Linda Gale, 100 times, and I have called Linda Gale to tell me about the HIV vaccine trial that failed, the microbicide trial that failed, the PrEP trial that failed. Like, Linda Gale's been at the coalface of this thing since the mid-1990s and been the principal investigator on so many trials of things that didn't work. And I called her up and said, tell me about these lenacapavir results. Because when Linda Gale opened the data got unblinded, right? And she was presented with the results of the young women who got the lenacapavir injection. She told me she didn't even know what she was looking at. Like, she couldn't understand what it was, because in the column under number of young women who got this injection and then contracted HIV, it was just zeros. It was only zeros. It was the first clinical trial that anybody who worked on this had ever seen where it was 100% effective. Like, you don't get that result. And even though people had been like a little bit excited about this drug, the idea that it protected every single young woman who got it from HIV in, like, I think it was 5 countries, and it was over the course of 2.5 years, it was astonishing. So here it is, right? Like, here's the thing that we've all been saying for so long that we need to turn the tide on HIV. So lenacapavir, here I am writing this story, and I get to paragraph 6, and I'm like, oh yeah, here's the paragraph about what it's going to cost and how we're going to get it. Lenacapavir is sold for $42,437 per patient per year in the US. Is there going to be a price for African countries? Is there going to be some sort of method of getting it there? Are we going to pre-make it ahead of time so that people get access? You may feel like you've encountered these questions before. I certainly feel like I've encountered them before. There's no answer. There's no access price. There's no access plan. Gilead has said exactly nothing other than how they recognize how important it is to make sure that young women have options. They've said nothing about how this is going to happen. So like 5 years after I first wrote a story about how you were going to possibly, like, the first drugs people were trying to get in sub-Saharan Africa were Gilead drugs. Here we are, same virus, same drugs, same company, same problem. exact same situation, right? Like as if we've never talked about this, as if we've never encountered this astonishing idea before. And I've become really concerned about this lately because I feel like there's not only have we not resolved it for the drugs and diseases that we've already been thinking about, but there's something else coming that I feel like the sand's being sucked out from underneath us, like we're standing on a beach, right? And it's sort of being pulled away without us really noticing. There's sort of this, I talk to a lot of people who call it like a golden age of medical innovation. But, I wrote a story late last year about FDA approval. This is probably the one that most of you will have seen if you've been paying attention to these. FDA approval for 2 therapies for sickle cell disease, gene editing, right? So they're amazing. The patients that I talk to, the patient has chemotherapy essentially to destroy their own bone marrow, and then you replace it with stem cells, with their own stem cells, but those stem cells have been edited so that you've changed the gene that causes their blood cells to sickle, which is the cause of all of the incredible pain and suffering that disease causes. So you edit out the sickle, you essentially edit the disease out of the person. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary piece of medical innovation, right? And it has huge promise. And so now you have these 2 therapies that have been approved in the US and Europe. Well, those therapies have been approved in the places where 2% of the global sickle cell burden is. Where's the sickle cell burden? It's in sub-Saharan Africa, right? It's in Nigeria, which overwhelmingly has the largest population of people with sickle cell. These therapies are initially on the market at about $3.3 million per person. That's obviously a challenge in the US, right? That's going to be a challenge for Medicaid. How are you going to pay for this? I will say, as a Canadian, in the kind of crazy logic of the US health system, maybe it makes sense to pay $3 million for a patient to have this therapy rather than to continue to need care otherwise. For Canada, that's going to be a question. It's really going to be a question in Nigeria, and kind of nowhere in the conversation around sickle cell therapy was there any kind of a conversation about access outside of the global north. And I write about these now kind of with increasing frequency, things like gene therapies. Not too long ago, I did a piece from Brazil about a gene therapy for a very rare disease called spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, which disables children very early in their lives and generally kills them early in their adolescence. It's a really nasty disease. And there are parents in Brazil of kids with SMA who are using their court system to sue for access to a gene therapy that's made by Novartis. And that therapy costs about $2.2 million per child. They're winning through the court system and they're getting access, but it is a really challenging question, right? It's a really interesting moral question for Brazil's public health agency. What could you do with $2.2 million, right? I mean, the life of this child is in front of you, and it's completely understandable why parents are demanding access to this drug. But also, if you are trying to administer Brazil's very tattered public health system, $2.2 million is a whole lot of money. And I feel as if there is this, there's new malnutrition numbers that came out this week. It's been a pretty astonishing growth in the number of malnourished children and deaths from undernutrition. And I feel like we're sort of at the precipice of this moment where there's a growing number of people, not a declining one, golden age notwithstanding, a growing number of people who are struggling to get access to basic resources for survival, and certainly struggling to get access to primary care. And over here, a group of people who are on the edge of starting to get access to a future where they can start to envision a life without disease. And we're embarking down that road without having addressed any of these challenges around access and equity. And Mike asked if I could talk a little bit about solutions today, and I feel like I don't have a lot to say about solutions, which in fairness, I think I'm just the storyteller. I'm just here to tell you what's going on. I didn't go into policy for a reason. I do have, a couple of thoughts, which I'm happy to talk about in a few minutes if anyone's interested in terms of questions. But things like de-risking and local manufacture, like those things are going to be important, but like very fundamentally, the architecture of this system in terms of access and equity, we haven't figured it out at all. And I feel like it's not a public, it's not a conversation. It's not a thing that I hear people talking about. I don't know what we do about, like, how do you ensure that diseases that only affect, or conditions that only affect poor people get any level of research? But then secondly, this class of things that are, when you have a drug or an intervention that's invented because for a condition like HIV that affects people in both high and low resource settings, what do you do about making sure that it also goes to the low resource settings? And then what do we do about making sure that innovation that's coming doesn't actually widen that gap instead of shrinking it? I don't know the answers to those questions. I do wish that we were talking about them more. And so I really appreciate you coming to listen to this today. Thank you. We're going to take some on Zoom as well, but if you have any questions,
Hey, Stephanie, Luke Davis. I'm one of the faculty in epidemiology and microbial diseases. Thanks for your talk and your reporting. I mean, I think you do a great job of explaining a lot of things that even we don't understand as people working in the field. My question for you is that I always feel like these stories about drugs, devices, vaccines kind of tell a story that obviously is exciting to readers, but kind of hide the real problems. And I love the example about sickle cell disease because it's an amazing technical therapy that requires amazing experienced physicians to deliver it. And, you know, as a critical care physician, sometimes I think about how can we address these problems when we need to build a health system and train providers. And I'm just wondering how you think about telling that story.
Thanks, Luke. I have like one other thing that I like to bang on about at great length, and that's how nobody cares about primary care. Nobody wants to talk about primary care. It's just not sexy. And then it doesn't matter how much freaking innovation you have if nobody gets screened for hypertension. I think that the sickle cell one is like, it is an interesting example, right? Because as it's currently being delivered, it's being done in it requires the absolute most sophisticated level of care. But I had an interesting conversation with Jennifer Doudna, who was one of the co-inventors of CRISPR, when we were talking about like I was asking her about genetic therapies and access, and she was pointing out like there was a point along the road there where if you were thinking about access, you would be building that in. Like, could this be done as a pill? How low resource could this be delivered actually, right? Like, instead of aiming for state of the art, what if you were thinking about from the beginning the fact that the people who were going to need it are in Nigeria? What if that was part of your target product profile, right? What if it wasn't just, can we, and like in fairness, it's the first and it's a big deal, whatever, but like, why isn't that access conversation about what is the way to design this that means it can be delivered in the lowest resource setting? Why is that not as important as efficacy in terms of the outcomes, right? Like, build that into the question from the beginning. I think you could put it, if you could assume a low level of access to certainly to tertiary care in a lot of these conversations. Arguably that should have been part of the malaria vaccine conversation as well, right? And it's really nice to see, it's the great appeal of lenacapavir is that it's going to require very minimal intervention. It's nice to see finally a recognition that along the way, some of these things that we've done wrong is not think about the fact that that's just as as important as efficacy is how you can deliver it, right? And what you're going to need to deliver it. And it's so rarely part of the scientific conversation.
Hi, Stephanie. Just wanted to say thank you for a great talk. I'm Pranjali Gupta. I'm a student in the MPH program here. So I spent like a few years working in consulting for pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things we worked on was these access pricing programs. And I just resonate a lot with it. It's also what pushed me into global health and moving this. One of the things I resonate in what you said is that any drug that's developed is first rolled out into US and Europe, and only then is access-based or equitable pricing considered for low-income countries. But my experience was that even in that, what these companies that I can't name tend to do is they'll break the world down.
It's all of them, so you're fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They'll break the world down into essentially tiers. And I remember sitting in a meeting where, majority of sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of the Southeast Asian countries were put into tier 4 and tier 5 and were essentially dismissed out of hand. And a lot of the justification was, as you said, the lack of an existing healthcare system that they felt. They were like, it's an out-of-pocket market. They don't have primary care sites. They won't be able to handle a multi-dosing regimen of an injectable. And therefore, we are not even going to try to consider pricing medication at any degree of equity for these countries. So I'm curious as to your perspective on what is not like the chicken and egg problem, because then we say, on one hand, pharmaceutical companies will not consider these countries for any degree of advanced therapy because they don't have primary care, or they don't have cold chain storage, or they don't have. But on the other hand, then where is the investment case? So is this like solely a private sector problem? Is this solely a public sector responsibility to first establish some degree of primary care? Just happy to hear your thoughts on how we can move forward in this conversation.
I think that part of that, there's huge frustration with medicine patent pool licenses because they tend to ignore all of Latin America. They ignore China. Middle income countries just get left out of these. The medicine patent pool never includes middle income countries. But it also, I've been hearing rumors. I've written a little bit about this, but there are rumors that Novo Nordisk in particular, but maybe also Eli Lilly, is getting all the way out of the business of making human insulin in pens. And their argument is that first world countries, to use their language, people buy analog insulin in pens, which is the standard of care, and that human insulin in vials is a standard of care in low-income countries because it's the cheapest and it's what the state procures. But that then misses, I'm trying to get a hard number for this and I don't have it yet, but like conservatively, I don't know, maybe 150 million people in India who can afford to buy their own insulin, who are buying there's a private sector market there that is a lot of people for whom there should be pricing consideration, right? And it just, there is we have our Burkina Fasos where we're gonna need support for a really long time, right? But it also just ignores, there's ever a tired phrase like the emerging global middle class, but like in fact, in Brazil, in Colombia, in India, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Thailand, Cambodia, there is a tier of people who will choose, rather than relying on a less effective therapy that they can get through the state, they will choose to put their family's resources into buying things publicly. But should they be paying the American price? Like, but that's like, if we're going to take like the overall access to medicines conversation as a conversation that's not really happening, that conversation that you just identified is like super not happening, right? Like that is not even among the access to medicines folks, that is not a conversation that's happening, which allows pharmaceutical companies to not even, they might get hammered for charging $42,000 for lenacapavir to Zambia, but nobody's going to come after them about, what they're charging in Colombia, which is why you saw Colombia do an amazing compulsory license for dolutegravir for an HIV treatment. How long ago? 3 months ago, 4 months ago, which is like a recognition that middle income countries are just being left out of this conversation altogether.
We're going to do one more question via Zoom, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Zoom question.
The question is, your knowledge of not only the vaccine efficacy, but the vaccine itself might be more than a scientist may know. Do you in any way have to censor yourself to not sound like you are a scientist and rather a reporter? Is there a line in the sand you must draw?
I just always, like it helps, like Johnny was saying, it helps that I have no science, but grade 10 biology was probably like my last science class. Thank you, Ms. Fex. You got to, it takes a lot for me to understand these things. And the best way for me to be able to explain them to other people is to have it explained to me a lot of times, right? But I always just, And I will say the Times is great about this. If I don't nail it, then 3 layers of editors are going to come along and say, what is this? I don't know what this means. Explain this. What is this? There's times when it's a little bit frustrating. There's times I think when we sacrifice precision, a degree of precision in order to make things accessible. And then I hear all of the virologists in the room, then you all write to me. That is not a clade. Yeah, I know. But like every so often we have to make some unpleasant choices. But as much as possible, if you can make things accessible to people, I guess maybe that's a flattering question. I don't think I sound like a scientist very often, but I always feel like I would want my grannies to be able to pick it up and understand it, right? And so you're going to lose readers if there's a whole lot of jargon in the first sentence and they don't know what it means. And so part of the journalistic challenge is to root these stories in people so that they feel relatable and it feels relatable to your life. But another part of it is to try to explain the science in a way that actually is both accurate and also something that people can take on board. So yeah, do I censor myself? No, but I do. Yeah, I do think about it a lot, about what is something that is both accurate but also readable. Thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming.